sorry for the problems. I just want to welcome back Mark Hopkins. We know he's an award-winning photographer and a frequent and popular speaker at SIL. His travelogues have transported us to diverse and fascinating places where we've learned about the people and the fragile environments in which they live. So buckle up, no passport needed. We're on our way to Africa. Take us there, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Judy. And welcome to the Kafkaesque world of Zoom.
Yes.
Yes. So I've entitled this talk, Walking the Thornveld at... Now, I used to start this talk by asking anyone who would dare to pronounce those last two words, but it's too cruel a thing to do. Because these are from the Zulu language, and in the next to last word, the HLU syllable that appears twice denotes a sound that doesn't exist in the English language. It's pronounced shr, which is sort of like in the word slush, but with a little gurgle added. So those two words would be uMfolozi. You would have guessed that, right? So now we got another problem here. Jesus. Now I got a problem with my computer. Okay, so with that settled, I want to share with you the wonderful work being done in Africa to protect and preserve its remarkable wildlife from the many threats of human population growth. We'll do that with a trek through the Thornveld of uMfolozi, which is a game reserve in the Republic of South Africa. uMfolozi is one of Africa's best run and most respected government-managed reserves, and I was there as an Earthwatch volunteer to help with their biennial game census. Now, I've never started a talk before with a photo of the door of a pickup truck, but the logo appearing in all of Hluhluwe's vehicles characterizes it so perfectly. The reserve is managed by the KZN Nature Conservation Service, whose name you see here at the top. KZN stands for KwaZulu-Natal, which is the province where the reserve resides. Its multicultural nature is reflected by the name appearing here at the top in English, then on the right in the Afrikaans language, and in Zulu on the left. The two symbols in the middle, the Zulu warrior shield and the rhino, are most pertinent. The shield signifies Zululand, the home of both uMfolozi and the Zulus, South Africa's principal ethnic group and one of Africa's most storied tribes. We'll touch on Zulu culture a little bit later. The other symbol in that logo is the rhinoceros, which is important because uMfolozi is famous for being the place where the white rhino was brought back from near extinction. It's a wonderful story of conservation at its best, and I'll come back to it after a little bit. Beyond that, the reserve is home to a broad and healthy population of African wildlife. So we'll look at depth at the wild animal species there, including a few surprises. But first, let's look at a map and see exactly where we are. This is the southern half of the continent of Africa. You can see the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom and the Congo Basin in gray at the top of the map. We'll zero in on this portion of the Republic of South Africa. Here it is close up, bordering on the Indian Ocean. At the upper left is Johannesburg, South Africa's largest city. To get to the reserve, you would normally first fly there, then catch a local flight to Richards Bay, a little lumber and mining town on the Indian Ocean. From there, you drive about 40 miles north to the uMfolozi Game Reserve. On this map, I also want to point out the tiny body of water that you can see just to the right of the red dot here. That's St. Lucia Bay, an interesting spot we're going to visit a little bit later. But right now, let's head into the reserve. This is the scenery as you drive into the park. It's all open savanna, cut through by several small, shallow rivers. Its rolling hills and patches of forest can be quite beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about the reserve itself. It's Africa's oldest wildlife reserve, dating back to 1895. It's about 360 miles square in size, and one of its unique features is that it's surrounded by 100 miles of elephant-proof fence to protect its wildlife and to keep the local cattle and poachers out. The land is pristine Thornveld, free of human habitation except for ranger stations. And it's home to the big five that tourists come to see: elephants, rhinos, buffaloes, lions, and leopards, plus a whole lot more. Here's the whole reserve. The ranger station where I stayed is here. To give you an idea of size, this is about 15 miles, and it's a bit more than that from there to the northern end. For tourists, there are just two entrances into the reserve, here and up here. When tourists enter the park by private vehicle, which is basically the way they all get there, the rules are strict. Remain in your car at all times. There are wild creatures everywhere, and walking around can be extremely dangerous. This is typical Thornveld, which is savanna scattered with trees that are primarily acacia. It's mostly open country, which is perfect for viewing the wildlife. The vistas are long, the scenery is impressive. The few small, shallow rivers that cut through it create green riverine areas. And the greenest parts are little swampy sectors like this. So here, can you see the wildlife in the photo? At the lower left, there's a monitor lizard sunning itself on the flat rock. And right smack in the middle, those two tiny black spots on the rock are basking turtles. No danger there. So this is the habitat that we were hiking through every day to do our census. Notice that the acacia tree here is leafless. That's because this was August, which, as you know, was midwinter in South Africa. Everything is backward there. We were there in winter because fewer leaves on the trees make it the best time to spot game. So let's turn to the animals we were there to work with. We'll start with the southern white rhino. This is the world's second largest land animal after the elephant, a big bull like this one tipping the scales at more than 5,000 pounds. There is also a northern white rhino in Africa, but all that are left today are two ancient females in Kenya, making that subspecies functionally extinct. Worldwide, there are 5 species of rhinos, 3 of which live in Asia. So here in South Africa, and here in Africa, the 2 species are this fellow, the southern white rhino, and the black rhino. These are 2 very different animals. White rhinos tend to gather in social herds. Black rhinos are loners, except to breed. The blacks are smaller and more agile. And while the whites are usually fairly benign and placid, the black rhinos tend to be ill-tempered and aggressive. In fact, black rhinos are considered Hluhluwe's second most dangerous mammal after elephants. Now, as you probably noticed, despite their names, both species in this illustration appear to be about the same color, which is in fact true. For example, here are 3 white rhinos. The brown one in the foreground, the brown on the one in the foreground is clay from wallowing in a water hole. Actually, black and white rhinos are about the same dark gray color. It's generally believed that the term white in the white rhino's name came from the Afrikaans words for wide, although there's even more debate on whether that refers to their mouths or their bodies. Where the word black came from, nobody knows. I took this photo of a big white rhino head-on in the grass, and I suspect wide refers to the enormous body. These guys are built like a municipal water truck. And by the way, I should tell you here that my proximity to some of these animals may make me look very brave, but keep in mind that I was using a substantial telephoto lens. This old bull was a good 40 yards away when I took the picture. As for the black rhinos, being mean-tempered and impulsive, their main attack preference is a head-on charge. This classic old photo is definitely not the way you want to be introduced to one. And here's why. Look at the damage this bull is inflicting. Photographs smashing into an old pickup truck. Look at the way his horn is bending the fender as if it were soft cardboard. Look at the power of that lunging body. Black rhinos are beasts to be reckoned with. But all that aggressiveness has not saved them from destruction. Beginning before the turn of the 20th century, all of Africa's big game animals were being decimated by wealthy sportsmen with their new high-powered rifles. The exercise was always the same. Take the boat to Africa, hire your guides, have them find the biggest possible specimen, aim your gun and drop the creature, get your picture taken, then cut off the head to take home for your trophy room and leave the carcass for the vultures and hyenas. Interestingly, the man with the black rhino in this historic photograph is the great conservationist and former US President Teddy Roosevelt. Go figure. By the late 19th century, the white rhino was generally thought to have been wiped out, extinct. But then in 1895, to everyone's delight and surprise, a small herd of white rhinos was discovered in the Hluhluwe region, and local conservationists commenced the hard and lengthy work of restoring the species. And by the way, notice the ragged condition of the bush in the foreground? That's typical elephant damage from feeding. Bringing back the white rhino took many decades, and the unknowns were challenging. How do you safely transport a 2-ton animal? How much tranquilizer does it take to immobilize it without killing it? Will rhinos breed successfully in confinement? What will it take? This historic photo shows one of the first rhinos to be successfully anesthetized for transporting. You can see the tranquilizer dart still in its shoulder. Over the past century, South African teams' hard work at uMfolozi achieved its goal of saving the white rhino from extinction. Today, its world population has increased from about 100 in 1895 to more than 16,000 animals, a reassuring achievement. But take a look at what was involved in bringing it back. You see the yellow dot at the tip of Africa? That's uMfolozi, where the surviving herd was found. The green areas mark the original range of the white rhino when it was at its peak. So the first challenge was to raise a population of healthy animals and then transport breeding pairs to wildlife reserves throughout that green sector. Then, as a precaution against poaching, drought, and land clearance by a growing African population, the next step was to transport breeding pairs to all the worldwide zoos shown here as red dots. This map dates back to 1973, and there have been many more zoo relocations since. But this will give you some idea of the complexity of saving a large mammal species. The biggest danger rhinos face today is poaching, and it is substantial. That big horn on this white rhino in the Asian black market today would sell for more than $100,000. Ounce for ounce, it's more valuable than gold. So it's no wonder the horns are so eagerly sought after by poachers. Why do people pay so much? Because there's a belief in China and Vietnam that the horn has extraordinary properties, both as an aphrodisiac and as a cure for everything from cancer to a bad hangover. And the sad thing is, rhino horn is basically keratin, the same thing as your fingernails and hair. There has never once turned up a single proof of its having any beneficial powers. But sadly, the persistence of that ridiculous myth is continuing to threaten the population of all the world's 5 species of rhino. There's a whole lot more to uMfolozi than just rhinos, as you might guess. So now let's look at some of the reserve's other big herbivores. At the head of the list, of course, is the African elephant. There are about 200 of them in the reserve, and they're considered Hluhluwe's most dangerous mammals. The Cape buffalo, which is the 3rd most dangerous mammal, thrive there in herds of up to 50. They're big, they're agile, and they demand the utmost respect, especially big, grumpy old males like this one. There are 3 species of zebra in Africa. These are the plain zebras, also referred to as big Burchell zebras, and these are the ones that populate Hluhluwe. The mountain zebra and the rare Grevy's zebra are found elsewhere on the continent. These are tough, feisty animals, and unlike their horse and donkey cousins, they have been found impossible to domesticate. Africa has 4 species of giraffe, of which Hluhluwe has the southern giraffe shown here. These were absolutely my favorite creatures. You have to stand near one to appreciate how enormous they are. That big head stares patiently down at you from 15 feet up in the air, and many of you could walk underneath that belly without bending. Warthogs were common sightings in our hikes through the Thornveld. They're not confrontational. Mostly we'd see them fleeing away with their tails pointed straight up, which is kind of comical. But when cornered, they can create significant damage, slashing with those huge tusks, as many young leopards have sadly discovered. Perhaps the most common herbivore sighting of all there was the impala. These small, graceful antelopes you see mostly in harem herds of 10 to 20, headed by an antlered buck like this one, or in smaller herds of adolescent bachelor males. Impalas are easy to identify if you remember, as the Zulus will tell you, to look for the McDonald's M on their rumps. Can you see that? There were 8 other antelope species there in Hluhluwe, but they were much more difficult to photograph. So I've instead shown them here this way. At the top is the wonderful kudu, an unbelievably stately, regal creature who I never got a good photograph of, unfortunately. To the right is the nyala, represented here by both male and female because their appearance is so different. In fact, for many years, they were thought to be 2 separate species. And below them is the little bush buck, and at the left is the water buck. Now you notice the prominent white ring on his rump? The Zulus have a story for that. They tell their children that back when God was busy creating the world, the water buck forgot and sat down on the toilet while the white paint was still wet. And that's how he got his rump. Here are the other antelope species we dealt with. At the top is the weird-looking blue wildebeest, which we commonly saw in herds of 20 or more. These are the same creatures you've probably seen pictures of migrating across the Serengeti by the thousands. A Zulu ranger explained to me that the reason they're so odd-looking is that when God had finished making the world, he found he had some leftover parts he didn't want to waste, so he used them to assemble the wildebeest. And down at the bottom are the 3 different duiker species. These are secret little loner antelopes that you seldom see. So those were the herbivore species that were the subjects of our census. There were many other interesting animals that we would not be working with because our focus was on plant eaters. Omnivore savanna baboons like this old lady were common. I took several pictures of her sitting by the roadside, contentedly scooping up and eating little scorpions. The only other monkey in that corner, besides the baboon, is the vervet monkey, which we'd encounter on occasion. If you want to see Africa's more spectacular monkeys, plus its gorillas, chimps, and bonobos, you need to go some 2,000 miles north. As for carnivores, the predators, these fellows rule the roost. We saw this handsome young yellow-maned lion several times. The leopards move mostly at night, so this is a borrowed shot, but I did score with a leopard that I'll show you later. And then there were the beautiful cheetahs, although I was never lucky to see one at Hluhluwe. One cat that's not so familiar, but is widespread in Africa, is the serval. It's quite small, standing 2 or 3 times the height of a common house cat, and its acrobatic skills are remarkable. I've seen films of a serval leaping up and snatching low-flying birds right out of the air. And also among the important carnivores were the spotted hyenas. Many nights I lay in my sleeping bag in our tent listening to their eerie, high-pitched cries as they hunted nearby. There was also the wild dog, a fascinating creature that some are attempting to rename the painted wolf. And also in the canid family is the black-backed jackal. And Hluhluwe has all manner of smaller denizens, from the banded mongoose that keeps the snakes under control, to the cuddly little African porcupine that no lion would dare tangle with, all the way to the elephant shrew, so tiny you could tuck 10 of them in your pocket. But now let's get to the reasons why we were there, which was to assist the uMfolozi staff and the government there in counting their herbivores. So why count them? The simple answer is All wild game in Africa today prospers only because it has been carefully managed year after year by dedicated biologists and rangers. They know how much graze and browse a reserve makes available to its herbivores. They know how much each animal requires. What they also need to know is, and that's why we were there, is how many animals they're dealing with. So that was our job, to count them. So specifically, why the count? Well, quite simply, is to identify and remedy either a population overabundance or the contrary, an unnatural species decline. Too many animals cause starvation. Too few can threaten the existence of a species. So the goal of the undertaking is to preserve a balanced ecology. And what's to be done what's to be done when the numbers reveal a problem? Well, if there are too many, the large ones get transported to other reserves and the small ones get culled and the meat taken to market. Or if there are too few, more are brought in from auctions or other reserves. Keeping a game reserve well-balanced and healthy requires ongoing attention. So how does the counting process work? You could do it by airplane, but then you'd miss that herd of 50 Cape buffaloes taking shade under that grove of green trees in the middle of the photo. You'd never see them. Aerial counts just don't work. You could assemble a crowd beating on tin pans and drive them out into view, but that would be far too disruptive. So the accepted method today is called distance sampling, a widely used technique originally developed to count dolphin and other oceanic mammals. Here's how it works. In our case, pathways called transects had been cut to make hiking easy, and each of us walked behind an armed ranger whose job was to keep us safe. Over the course of the program, volunteers walked 26 transects over 8 weeks. Ours was one of 4 teams, each visiting for 2 weeks. The average hike was just short of 5 miles. All herbivores spotted within 500 meters on either side were recorded with the following data. What species and how many? How far away were they? In what direction? And what was their GPS position? From these data, the population of the reserve would later be concluded by computer analysis. Each of us teamed up with an armed ranger to walk our transect. We couldn't have done it without these guys. They're all local Zulus. They knew the animals. They knew where to look and what to expect. And they were incredibly sharp-eyed. They didn't speak much English. So to make it easier, we learned an animal names in Zulu. In a typical sighting, the ranger would stop suddenly and say, "Intabane," and hold up 3 fingers. Intabane is the Zulu word for warthog. I'd look and finally spot one gray ear waggling behind a bush. And I'd say, 3, and he'd nod. Then we'd take 10 steps and out would flush 3 apprehensive warthogs to disappear into the bush. These guys nailed it every time, and we couldn't have done it without them. If you look carefully in the center distance here, you can see a transect cut down through the hill, through the tall grass. They were mowed by the rangers prior to the survey, simply to make the walking easier and to create a common source for our data. Here's the southern sector of uMfolozi, and here's a typical 4-mile transect. Notice that it runs from one road to the other, so we could be dropped off and picked up. There were 13 of them. We always notice that these are all done from right to left. That's because that would be east to west. And the reason we were walking in that direction is to keep the morning sun behind us for visibility. And that last sector that I just put up there was my favorite because we got to take our boots off wade through the river at the end of it and cooled off. Okay, so this is me dressed for action. Around my neck, I've got a compass, a rangefinder, a hand GPS. There's a clipboard in my left hand, binoculars in one pocket, water flask in another, snacks in another, and the lumpy pocket by my right hand holds my camera. By the way, Look carefully behind me and you'll see a horizontal orange cable stretched out about 4 feet off the ground. This was taken at our campsite, and at night the generators came on and charged that cable with 8,000 volts to keep curious elephants out. But it was high enough for leopards and hyenas to walk underneath, so plenty of caution was called for if you had to get up during the night. This was the form on which we collected our data. At the top, we listed our names, dates, starting time, weather conditions. Each sighting got its own entry. Number 1 here shows the code RW, indicating, as you might guess, white rhino. It says there were 2. Was I sure about the sighting? Yes or no? Because sometimes we weren't sure. How far away were they? What was the sighting and transect compass bearings? What were the latitudes and longitudes of their location? What was the vegetation and weather like? A lot of precise information for the computer. The next one down is GI, where I cited 4 giraffes. On my best day, I filled an entire sheet like this with entries. At the end of each hike, we returned to the campsite and spent an hour feeding all that data into the computer. The final population calculations would then be made after the end of the 8-week census program. When we first arrived there, orientation briefings held by the program director in this delightful pondside setting were very clear, very thorough. This is Sue Van Rensburg, the government-employed ecologist who directed the program. She was a delightful person. Much of her briefing was on personal safety. It included reassuring recommendations like, and I quote, "If you're caught by a charging Cape buffalo, go face down, lie absolutely flat, and you'll probably be okay because the curve of their horns is configured so they can't gore you in that position." As for encounters with a charging black rhino, it was climb a tree or at least get behind one. Now, I have to confess that after hearing that, it seemed like just about every tree I passed along the transects looked like this, a twisted, forbidding tangle of formidable 2-inch thorns. Happily, I never had to try and climb one. But I actually did have a very exciting encounter with a black rhino that I'll tell you about a little bit later. So the survey began. The day after our briefing, we headed off to work, rising an hour before dawn in order to be hiking the trails at first light with the sun rising through the swirls of morning mist. This was a typical scene as we set off for the day's work, the dawn light still dim as the day began. Each of the rangers was armed with a 7.62 caliber military rifle, which concerned me a little bit because it doesn't quite have the stopping power you need for a charging 2-ton animal. But that was the system there. Mile after mile, we walked some 60 miles through the Thornveld over 2 weeks, following the ranger's footsteps and very dependent on his expertise in spotting game. These guys were so skilled at what they were doing. This was a typical sighting. Can you see the Burchell zebra about 50 yards back in the bush? It wasn't like walking around a zoo. And zebras stand their ground and aren't spooked by humans, but the sightings took concentration. It wasn't like strolling around a zoo at all. You had to pay attention and be constantly alert. Here's another typical sighting. These are impalas, and we had to be vigilant because there could be an additional 10 or more feeding behind those bushes. Also, great caution was called for because any abrupt movement on our part would send them all fleeing before we could count them. This is a typical gathering of wildebeests. Normally, you'd hear their silly-sounding grunts long before you came upon them, so they were easy to spot. Not so easy to count, though, when they were packed so tightly. White rhinos were also easy to detect, as you might imagine. Although after I recorded this particular one, we discovered she had a tiny calf hidden beneath her chin. This was actually a double sighting. If you look carefully behind the rhino's rump, you'll see 4 zebras crossing the veld 100 yards in the distance. All the antelope species were quick to take flight, so you had to work fast. These are 3 water bucks, as you can tell from the toilet seat mark on the one on the right. Notice how alert and tense they are? A few more seconds and poof, they were gone. The giraffes were a real kick, so benign and aloof. looking down at Usher as if to say, just keep moving along. Can't you see I'm having my lunch? The Zulu word for giraffe is Hluhluwe, which translates to eats at top of trees. The Cape buffaloes required a lot of caution. They live in large herds, which are presided over by the dominant cow. The threat to humans comes mainly from old bulls like this one, because when the lead cow decides an old male has reached the end of its usefulness to the herd, she banishes him. And he spends the rest of his life being lonely and very pissed off. We were told from the beginning, don't bother with the elephants. We know how many there are, and getting close puts you at real risk. If you come close to across elephants, back off and get out of there. So this is how we prefer to spot elephants, far, far away. This was my first white rhino sighting as I walked the transects, and it was a tense one. The light spot you can see by her head, can you see that? Just below her head, was her tiny calf. And the problem with a sighting like this is that calves are curious and liable to trot over and check you out. And behind the calf, of course, comes an apprehensive 3,000-pound mother. So we gave these two a wide berth for safety's sake. And as I mentioned before, one of my favorite transects ended up with a shallow river crossing, which was great for cooling off. There was no danger in a river this shallow. But downstream, where it was deeper, one had to pay careful attention because Nile crocodiles were at large. As for other reptiles, by the way, there were many snakes in the reserve, some of them very dangerous, but they kept to themselves, and I never saw a single one. The snake to be most concerned about in Hluhluwe is the deadly poisonous black mamba, because unlike most snakes, it can actually be aggressive towards humans. Happily for us, the mambas were busy with other matters. Here's another animal I haven't talked about yet. Want to take a guess as to who lives here? I'll give you a clue in case you paid attention to what your grandkids have been looking at on television. Do you recognize that? Well, as this ranger well knew, it's the aardvark. That was Arthur Aardvark, for those of you who didn't recognize it. And it looks like this, the aardvark. Aardvarks, which are also called ant bears, are strange creatures, snoozing underground all the day and wandering freely at night. They live almost entirely on ants and termites, consuming as many as 50,000 of them in a single meal, and they're extremely elusive. In fact, the head ranger told me that in his 27 years at the reserve, he'd only seen 2. But to me, the most fascinating creatures we encountered were the huge, placid white rhinos. There was seldom a day when we didn't come around a bend and find a scene like this. Those are birds on our back, by the way. They're red-billed oxpeckers that feed on skin parasites. And speaking of birds, we didn't experience many during our stay there because large numbers of them had migrated north for the winter. One that we saw plenty of, in fact, several species of them, were the vultures. Their job is to clean up the kills that the carnivores leave behind, and they're always lurking nearby, watching and waiting for their next meal. The one bird I will never forget was this one, the Hadida ibis. It's got to be the world's noisiest bird, and what a racket it makes. We'd encounter them when we approached the water holes, when they'd fly up and herald our arrival with a cascade of raucous squawks that would alert every creature within 2 miles that intruders were afoot. But there are also a few more colorful bird species around to perk things up. These lovely little European bee-eaters added a special touch to the surroundings. So a few words about where I stayed. This is Masinda Camp, Hluhluwe's ranger station. It's a working facility. No tourists have reason to stop there. Everything about the place is functional and Spartan. Resident buildings to house the scientists and rangers and us. That army tent in the middle of the photo was home for me and a few others for our 2-week stay. The right-hand building held showers, toilets, kitchen, dining room. The food was simple but nourishing, and there was even electricity when the generator was running. This was the reserve's head ranger with the wonderful name of Abednego Mkwanazi. He's with his niece, Sudlagumbi, who worked in the kitchen. I had great chats with Abednego, who, as you can imagine, had some fascinating stories to tell. And in case you biblical scholars in the audience were wondering, I asked Abednego, and yes, he does have a brother named Shadrach. My favorite staff member there was Tina, who was an assistant to the director. One day, a local Zulu chap she didn't know tapped on her window and announced that he was interested in her hand in marriage and was prepared to pay 6 cows. Tina turned him down flat. 3 days later, he was back tapping on her window again and up the offer to 9 cows. Tina replied, look, I'm about to go to college and get a degree. If you're still interested in 4 years, come back and see me. The day I left, I gave Tina a big hug and said, don't you dare settle for any less than 100 cows. In no time, the first week of hiking the transects was over. We had Sunday off, and I visited another reserve, the nearby St. Lucia estuary. You recognize these creatures? This is home to about 800 hippopotamuses, and we got very close to them by boat. This was an added treat because in the Hluhluwe Reserve, there were only a few hippos in one tiny corner, and we never saw them. Hippos can be very dangerous. In fact, they kill more humans in all of Africa each year than any other African mammal. Because they're herbivores, the deaths result from their territorial tendencies, not carnivorous instincts. Most occur when they capsize boats transporting humans who cannot swim. Happily, the boat I was on was 60 feet long, so we didn't have to worry. St. Lucia is also home to many huge Nile crocodiles, and I was impressed with how enormous they are. This big fellow would be about 16 feet long. That open mouth you see in the photo is not a threatening gesture, by the way. It's simply how crocs keep cool when basking in the hot sun. And by the way, I had crocodile pizza for lunch later that day, and I don't recommend it. The bird life was interesting too, including sea eagles and many water birds. This is the Goliath heron, the world's largest heron, that stands some 5 feet tall. In the background, you can see the mangrove that borders the estuary. Those vertical stems that you can see are not plants. They're mangrove roots absorbing oxygen out of the air. Hippos graze in dry land at night and spend their days immersed like this. That's a pair of them resting their heads on the back of a third. These big beasts stick to shallow water. They don't swim as much as they just walk on the bottom. And at night, they'll range several kilometers inland in search of good graze. One of the cows had a tiny calf born just a week ago, which you can see at her side here. So remember those eyes if you're ever in hippo country. These are short-tempered, mean, very powerful creatures that demand a lot of respect. The next day was Monday, and it was back to another week of walking the transects. And what a surprise we had right before sunrise that morning. 6 of us, 3 team members and 3 Zulu Rangers, were in the back of a pickup truck approaching our transect. Suddenly, there was a huge bang. Truck stopped dead. All of us in the back were in a huge tangle of legs, arms, and rifles. A big Cape buffalo had dashed blindly out of the tall grass in the darkness, and the truck crashed into it dead center. Happily, no one was hurt, and we found out later that the buffalo had nothing more than a cut on its shoulder, but the truck was left, as you can see here, with $2,000 worth of damage. And so we went on for another week, hiking behind our rangers, traipsing 4 to 5 miles a day, collecting data along the transects. One afternoon, coming back from our hike, again riding in the back of our pickup truck, we encountered this scene. A very large young bull elephant had stopped a bus full of tourists and was having a great time harassing it. But when he noticed us and saw how much smaller we were, he immediately spun around and came charging after us. But Abednego, our driver, was expert in these matters. He slammed the truck into reverse, gunned it, and we were quickly out of there. This apparently caused the young bull a bit of embarrassment because he immediately stopped by the roadside, reached up with his trunk, snapped off a huge branch, and made it quite clear that what he had really intended was not to chase after a stupid truck full of humans, but simply to savor a little roadside snack. These young bulls experience a condition called musth, which is MUSTH, which is caused by an youthful onrush of testosterone. They get feisty and belligerent. They tend to challenge everything in sight. Sometimes they can cause a lot of damage. Happily, this time, we got spared. During our briefings, we learned a bit about the very interesting culture of the Zulus, South Africa's principal ethnic group. And dance was a big part of that, as wonderfully depicted in this old 19th century lithograph. But when the director told us one day, after Transect walks today, jump in the truck and we're going to take you to see Zulu dancing, we all assumed, uh-oh, sounds like a tiresome act in a tacky tourist roadhouse outside the reserve, but we went anyway. And little did we know the delightful surprise we were in for. This is a typical view of Zululand after we left the park in the back of our pickup truck. It's farmland, cattle country. Crops don't grow much there, just people and cattle. Cows are wealth to the local population. In the foreground, you can see a typical Zulu kraal or family compound with its traditional round rendezvous huts. It's poor, it's modest, it's functional. It's been that way for centuries. One thing that impressed me, I've been in a lot of third world countries and was always impressed to see the local modes of transportation, people riding bikes, tractors, donkeys, scooters, water buffaloes, whatever means is available. But not here. Here, everybody walked. Well, we arrived at our destination, and it was not at all what we expected. There was no tourist roadhouse. It was the local high school for the region. And what a sad eye-opener it was, surrounded by barbed wire for protection, not from animals, but from locals stealing building materials. Inside this building was the school's assembly hall, with the desks pushed aside for the event we were about to witness. Blackboards on the wall, no glass in the windows that had all been broken or stolen. And look at the floor. This was the center of education for the area. We were given seats at the near end. The show began with the appearance of the teacher on the left, who one incidentally would be referred to in South Africa as a person of traditional build. Her 10 students filed in. She whacked out an infectious rhythm on her big drum. The kids burst into song, and all of us were instantly memorized and swept away by their talent. It was all in Zulu, of course, but they were funny, they were dramatic, the music was melodic, and their harmonies were perfect and compelling. We were told afterwards that their song was about HIV/AIDS, which back then, this was 2004, was becoming a huge health problem in South Africa. The tone was upbeat, instructional, entertaining, and inspirational. The youngsters were fabulous, and we gave them a standing ovation at the end. They filed out afterwards, and a troupe of teenage male dancers took to the floor. This was a traditional Zulu warrior dance, barefoot, dressed in animal skins, doing flips and somersaults, all to the infectious beats of a half a dozen rhythmic drums. And as you remember from that picture that I showed you of the floor, I don't know why they didn't have 3 broken ankles, but it was a dramatic and wonderful performance. For me, this was one of the most memorable surprises of the entire trip. The kids were so good, and it was so heartwarming to see how they and their teachers were focused on preserving their tribal heritage. Afterwards, we spent some time with the school principal, and it was distressing to hear how little money and support the school receives from the government. But it was nevertheless thrilling to see how well they do with such limited resources. After it was over, I yelled, "How about a group shot?" And some of the performers instantly assembled themselves. Don't you love the combination of traditional Zulu textiles and schoolgirl wool socks and shoes? I just love it. After I get back to America, I sent prints of these photos, my photos, to the principal to give to the kids. One of the joys we had after each day's work was driving around the reserve just to see what there was to see. This was a typical scene, encountering a troop of savanna baboons out cavorting. The young ones were always comical and so much fun to watch. And it was a chance to witness the interactions of so many creatures in the comfort of their own natural environment. It was like being a fly on the wall of classic Africa. We did a few night trips driving around with a spotlight, which is especially when you get to see leopards. This female crossed the road in front of us, and when we got her in the spotlight, she patiently laid down in the tall grass to wait us out. We drove in a little closer, and just as I was about to get a better shot, my camera started flashing, battery dead, battery dead. And this was the unfortunate result, a badly exposed, out of focus shot from my only leopard sighting when she decided she'd had enough and headed into the bush. It was fortuitous, though. Many visitors don't get to see them at all. Well, it was our final day of walking the veld, and I still hadn't encountered a black rhino. Alfred the ranger and I were ambling along in our last transect together. It was quiet and warm. We were recording only a few sightings and just daydreaming along when suddenly, and with no warning, all hell broke loose. It happened so fast, I never got to touch my camera. So I had to set up this shot afterwards to commemorate the scene. Now you see those two green bushes just ahead of him? You can see it a close up here. The transect ran between them, and just as Alfred disappeared behind the right-hand bush, 10 feet ahead of me, everything exploded. There was a huge commotion I couldn't see. Alfred was shouting, "Ubajane, Ubajane," which is the Zulu word for black rhino, and then a string of Zulu, which clearly meant climb a tree, and of course there wasn't a nearby tree in sight. Alfred then came backing up in a panic, almost knocking me down, chucking live shells out of his rifle in a total state of shock. And right then, a black rhino that had been munching on the backside of the bush and was just as astonished as Alfred when they came nose to nose, burst into sight beyond the bushes and hightailed it across the far field. What a magnificent sight seeing that creature. When I later found this photograph and borrowed it to show you because it's exactly the image I saw of that 2,500-pound rhinoceros dashing across the open veld and disappearing into a wooded ravine. Despite their chunky appearance, black rhinos are surprisingly agile and graceful, and they've been clocked at running over 35 miles an hour. What a finale this was for my 2-week adventure. I should mention the African rhinoceros's survival status here. This is the black rhino. It's not in good shape. It's considered critically endangered with a world population of around 6,000. As we saw earlier, white rhinos are doing a little better, but they're still considered threatened and are down 12% from 5 years ago, owing mainly to poaching. For comparison, African elephants, which are considered endangered themselves, are down 60% over the past century, again because of poaching. But happily, there's still over 400,000 of them in Africa, and international restrictions on ivory sales have reduced that poaching. The truly encouraging news here is that Africa's more than 250 government-run and private game reserves, over 250 of them, have done a good job nurturing, propagating, and protecting these wonderful creatures. And the outlook for the future is guardedly optimistic. So I want to close with a sequence of shots that I hope captures life in uMfolozi, sorry. Word was out, there was a breeding pair of lions at a nearby wallow. So we headed there one afternoon. The only activity we found at first was this huge white rhino bull taking a mud bath. When we arrived, he was on his back with all 4 feet in the air. But by the time I got my camera focused, he'd rolled over and was headed for drier ground. When he reached the dry grass with a small herd of impala ahead, can you see them over his head? He made a typical white rhino move. Can you see what's happening here? I'll enlarge that a bit. Male rhinos urinate backwards as sort of a misty spray, and the old bull is simply leaving his calling card, or as he might have better put it, just a little something to remember me by. As he wandered off, we noticed the impalas were fidgety and on alert, most of them watching something going on over their shoulders. And just then the mating pair of lions arose from the tall grass at our left, where they'd been napping. They wandered over to the edge of the wallow. Then suddenly something panicked the impalas, and the entire herd that you can see in the distance here leapt up and dashed up a hillside to the right, where they reassembled, apprehensively eyeballing the place where they'd just been. This is a small harem. The buck is the second one from the left. And then out of the tall grass walked the reason for their concern. The lioness crossed the wallow, greeted the breeding lioness, which was most likely her sister, and then moved on. And at that point, the breeding lioness backed up to the male and pointedly reminded him that the day wasn't over and they still had important work to do. Now, with respect for their privacy and in the interest of good taste, I have censored the next photograph, but it was over very quickly. And here you can see the lioness still prone, with her tail lovingly wrapped around the male's leg. Lions typically couple 100 times or more during a female's 4 to 5 day estrus. And even then, the rate of conception is about 50%. So making lion cubs is a demanding challenge. Here's one final picture to share with you. I took it the day we departed for home to record for posterity this large committee of giraffes that assembled to send us on our way with their appreciation for our 2 weeks of hard work and dedication. What a privilege it was to have been of service to them. So that's my story, and thank you for being here and sharing the adventure. And if there's any question, maybe I can answer them.
Thank you, Mark. That was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Unbelievable. If you have a question for Mark, you can put it in the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I'm wondering, Mark, what kind of a camera you used?
What did I use then? I used to have a big set of Nikon with with all kinds of lenses and equipment, a great big bag that I carried. And when I went to Africa, I said, I can't carry this stuff.
Yeah.
I got rid of all the Nikon stuff, and I got a Panasonic. No, Panasonic. Yeah, I think that was the first one. Yeah, a point and shoot camera, a sophisticated point and shoot camera with lots of controls on it, but something I could put in my pocket. And
Wow.
that's all I've used ever since.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, so it's a fixed lens point and shoot camera.
Terrific. Terrific. Anybody want to put a question in the chat? Okay, let's see what we have. What does it take to become one of the counters?
Go to earthwatch.org. Earthwatch.org. I've done 4 of their expeditions. It's a wonderful organization. What they do is they sponsor field research and charge people like us a fair amount of money. I think $3,500 to participate in this thing. And all that money becomes the operating budget of the research that they're doing. It's a wonderful concept. So check them out. They may even be doing this biennial survey still, because they were doing it every 2 years the last I checked. But go in there, there's all kinds of things going on all over the world, and they're wonderful.
We have another question. Do you think that areas that allow people to walk with lions in Zimbabwe or elsewhere is a good idea?
No. You don't fool around with wild animals.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never saw a lion while we were walking, because during the day they're sleeping. And if we had, I would have been damn glad that I was behind a guy with a rifle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where with Earthwatch, were you in Honduras with Earthwatch? What other places have you been with Earthwatch?
The first one I did was a wildlife census in Tasmania, the island south of Australia. So we camped out there for 2 weeks, and see, the next one was catching octopuses in Costa Rica.
Wow.
And then this Africa thing. And then the fourth one was spending 2 weeks on a riverboat on the Amazon doing a wildlife census in Peru.
Wow.
So that gives you an idea of some of the diversity of what you're doing. And they also do archaeological digs, and I think the one that amused me the most was spending 2 weeks in Ireland on bicycles going from town to town, investigating remnants of animist religion among Roman Catholics.
That's bizarre. Amazing, amazing.
Drank a lot of beer.
Good beer too, that's for
Yeah,
sure. Do you
right.
have any other questions? And if you should have a question that you don't want to share right now, you can put it on our website and send it to our Gmail box, and I'll forward it to Mark. But Danielle and Mark, thank you very much, and all of you who participated, we really appreciate it.